All right, so everyone, this is a especially interesting conversation. Today, I'm joined by Carolyn Cochran, who is from Oklo Technologies. I'm not going to say a thing about this. I'm going to let Carolyn do a lot of the introduction on what this company is all about because it stands to, I think, change the way that we think about energy and nuclear energy in particular for generations to come. So, Carolyn, thank you so much for making time to join me on the show. Let's just dive into your business and yourself and this journey, this remarkable journey you've been on. Tell us about Oklo.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's exciting to be here and learning about what all you do as well. Yeah, so Oklo, I think, one of the interesting things is that nuclear technology has been around forever, but I think what we're rediscovering as a species basically is the promise that it has to solve the big problems we have right now. Um, you know, and so in a sense, and a lot of times when we actually explain this to people, what we're doing is very old. And they're like, well, why haven't we done this before? And I think it really is that rediscovery of the promise that it has for the future of humanity and for the planet. So when we're looking at loss of biodiversity, loss of land space, climate change, and also just thinking ahead, even as some futurists do about living on other planets, or how do we survive on this planet with what is our peak population going to look like, and how are we going to power it cleanly and in the most efficient way possible. And those roads always lead you back to nuclear energy. And so I think for various reasons, many people have started rediscovering that, and we happen to be in the right place at the right time. We've been working on this for some time now, but one of our thesis was, hey, there's many different ways to split an atom, actually. And people will try to sell you like, oh, this technology is the best and this one's the best. And there's still, there's pluses and minuses to a lot of different ways of doing it. But to us, it's really what didn't take off in the past was really the business model. There's just big kind of entities, I'll name names like GE and Westinghouse, that made their two big plants basically, and sold it to these big utilities across the country. And that was successful for a long time. But I think in the modern era with cost overruns and large plants just being really complicated and increasingly so, and we see in this modern world, again, focus on climate change, but also the distribution of the grid and distributed energy resources, and looking at what does the future of the grid look like. And it's not that model. And so we thought, let's start small with a business model that works for customers. We saw all these customers that need power now, and a lot of utilities that are trying to get out of the generation business so much as the distribution business. And we thought, what we need to do is build, own, and operate and sell power to customers that need it.
It's one of those things. I guess when I first heard of Oklo's mission, there was an interesting factoid that really stopped me in my tracks, and it was to do with the reuse of fuel, nuclear fuel that had been used in these other conventional reactors for some time, and that in the
Yeah.
United States alone, there is a lot of it being stored, and
Yes.
it is stored safely, but it's going to be there for a really long time.
Yeah.
And the reuse of that spent fuel, if you like,
Hmm.
has the potential to power the United States alone for something like 100 plus years, just that
Yes.
fuel source. And that blew my mind.
Exactly.
So
Hmm.
obviously you and the team have been spending the better part of a decade plus thinking about that particular problem. And I'm very
Yeah.
keen, coming from the biotech background, to
Hmm.
sort of overlay the regulatory side of this, because so much of this has to do
Yeah.
with regulation, as it does in your space. What brought you to Oklo in the first place? What was the thing that really captured you on this journey early on?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, recycling nuclear waste was a key part of what led to the founding of Oklo. So, on top of what I kind of already said, which was, hey, we saw customers that needed power now. Um, so, me and my co-founder Jacob DeWitt met at MIT, and one of the first times we worked together was as teaching assistants for this course for utility executives. And so, CEOs, C-suite, general counsels, and so forth would come from utilities to MIT for a month, and they'd send their executives to learn about nuclear energy, usually because they had a nuclear power plant in that utilities portfolio.
Right.
And so we'd be the grad student TAs for this course that they were taking, but we also spent kind of day and night with them, from breakfast, lunch, dinner, and their homework afterwards, and sometimes just time in between. And so one of the things that Jake did in particular, and I was along for the ride, was really ask these utilities, what would you be interested in building, and what are your customers seeing? And they're very generally, utilities would admit readily that they're risk averse. They're large, kind of slow moving entities, and what's cheapest and what's most expedient is what they're going to do. So when it comes to nuclear fuel, it's still cheapest to just mine fresh material and enrich it and use it in their power plants. But one of the things that Jake was aware of and I learned about and around that time was, hey, there's this incredible potential in the used fuel that's out there. But what would make utilities interested in this? And again, we came to the conclusion that we'd build, own, and operate, and fuel is one of our biggest costs. And so even though for utilities, kind of this mining and use of fresh material is the cheapest way for them to do it historically, when you use a reactor like what we're using, it's called a fast reactor. Mm-hmm. The fast neutrons actually can fission way more atoms. And that way you can make use of the rest of the energy and fuel. So one of the analogies we've used is usually these kind of large conventional reactors that we have around the United States and really around the world. You have a global audience, of course, and my frame of reference is the United States, but on average, these kind of large light water cooled reactors use about 3% of the energy that's in the fuel and then throw it away. I put that in air quotes because, it's being stored. And I think people have historically thought there's a way to use it in the future, but mostly once it's been irradiated, so once those neutrons are bouncing around, they create radioactive elements that have a half-life of thousands of years. And but one of the cool things is when you use fast reactor, fast neutrons, they can fission way more, and so they fission those things with those long half-lives, and so they actually reduce the number of those atoms, in the meantime making energy. So you're consuming the waste while creating clean energy and reducing the half-life, so that we can use, people say you can close the fuel cycle. It depends on how you want to do it, but you can use the bulk of the remaining 97% of the energy that's in there, and what you're left with is something that can be turned into glass and stored for on the order of a few hundred years. But yes, to your point, exactly true. And it usually does stun people to learn that just that used fuel that we have in just the United States could power the United States for about 100 years. And it's about parallel. The amount of used waste that there is in the world could power the world for about 100 years. And you could come up with different numbers closer to 150 or even more, but we usually use the round number of 100. But the fact is the amount of energy in it that's just sitting there is immense, and the cost reductions could be huge. And so we could have not just clean and reliable energy, but really relatively cheap energy once we unlock the recycling process. And I do use recycling on purpose. Reprocessing is what people have heard, and it is in fact a form of reprocessing. But the way that we do the recycling doesn't involve extracting out things that you'd have to extract out in order to use it in these big older plants. So we don't have to extract out these things that are kind of concerning to have isolated, for instance, plutonium for like weapons proliferation. We don't extract that out. We just recycle the fuel and put it back in the reactors in order to use it. So it kind of takes away all of the big concerns that there have been historically with reprocessing, while making use of this waste that we're currently just storing, and we could use it to power and reduce energy costs.
So I'm imagining the people listening or watching this were either driving, on a jog, in the gym, and they've just had to stop for a minute and just go, sorry, what? How is this possible? Now, if we go back in time, and timing is everything in companies like the ones that we've built and like what you're building here. If we go back to the 60s and the 70s, where there was this idea that nuclear fuel now is something that we can really start to use. My understanding of what happened in the States in sort of the 70s, maybe early 80s, was
Mm,
that there was a level of regulation put into place, ultimately with an intent to make nuclear power safer given the completion of the Cold War. But that ended up essentially creating a lot of difficulty in evolving from the model that was approved for use at that time. And as a consequence, I guess there's a style of reactor which is now prolific today, which for some reason still makes it quite difficult for new breakthrough technologies like what Oklo is
mm,
doing to try and come to market. Is that a fair assessment of what the last sort of 40 or 50 years has been regulation
yeah,
wise in the States?
I'd say so. Yeah, yeah, I think it's a good characterization. I think in many ways, this is a bit of a hot take. Well, not hot in the sense of being fresh and off the top of my head, but hot in terms of being maybe controversial compared to how a lot of people portray it. I think it's easy to portray the regulator as the big bad guy, but I
Mm,
think in many ways, the industry itself uh, was just complacent and stupid,
yeah.
basically. I think, yeah, in the wake of a lot of public fear, so, 3 Mile and Chernobyl, stuff like that, instead of showing how safe they were, talking about it, having a real conversation with the public about what did and didn't happen, right? If those are the worst accidents that have ever happened in the history of nuclear power, it's still far safer than any other form of electricity, even, and it's a bit macabre, but even with solar panels or wind turbines, people fall, people get
Mhm.
injured, and so forth. And there are, different kinds of injuries that occur. And so there's such a great story to tell, but I think this industry just stuck its head in the sand and basically waited to go away. And and I think in that way, the regulators did what the public was demanding of them,
Mm.
um, and the industry didn't modernize. So that's another piece of it, really. And one of the things we've really focused on is like, look, the automotive industry, you can see what they did in quality assurance on automotive, like especially the Japanese automakers, and how they were able to start making cars with incredible reliability that could go, hundreds of thousands of miles and stuff like that. And the quality assurance kind of modernizations that happened in the 80s and 90s, the nuclear industry basically just didn't pick up on that. One of the
Mm.
things that we focused on is doing electronic document control and modern QA methods. And when I say modern, I feel like it's modern as of 30 or 40 years ago,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Like, and when I was looking to hire the best people in this area, and one of my qualifications was you have to be comfortable with electronic records, I literally had some of them say, you can't do that. It's going to be too hard. Like literally
Mhm.
paper is the way to go. So that's just
I
maybe
agree.
a snapshot for people who are not familiar with this industry of how backwards they allowed themselves to become and kind of stagnant. And I think maybe an analogy for better for worse, it's kind of controversial perhaps, but like SpaceX or Tesla, I think they really thought, let's build a vehicle from the ground up with electronic motors and like electric motors and modern electronics and Google Maps and stuff like that, instead of trying to backfit kind of an old style
Mhm.
car with these kind of features. And I think that's kind of how we've come about it, is like, let's just rethink all these things and do it the way we should do it in modern day with, advanced computing and capabilities of doing electronics and all these kinds of things that should make, having a high quality assurance really doable. And additionally, your original kind of point was around the regulations. Let's meet the regulations by using a technology that inherently meets the regulations because it is inherently safe, instead of trying to take big older designs. And I say older, I mean it's older in the sense of that's what was implemented
Mhm.
previously, although there's decades of history on the fast reactor design we're using. It's in that sense old, but it hasn't been implemented commercially. And so let's use these designs that have been proven out, that have shown that they're safe. You can meet the regulations without a lot of belts and suspenders, so to speak, by using a technology that's already meeting the safety requirements, instead of trying to put a lot of belts and suspenders on something that's more difficult to ensure the safety.
So you and I think, have quite a unique lens on regulation. We're going to get to that in a second, but let's sort of walk
Yeah.
through maybe a practical example of one of your projects. The Aurora powerhouse
Hmm.
is designed to be, I think, vastly different to what people would imagine in their minds a nuclear reactor to look like. So
Hmm.
people will be listening to this and watching this. How would you describe that? And we'll put links in the show notes so they can click through and see the visual
Yeah.
representation of this. But this is
Hmm.
quite something. So how does that powerhouse look and feel different to a layman compared to if they drove past a giant dome that had big stacks? That is the conventional nuclear reactor.
Yeah. Yeah, I think thanks for kind of bringing up that topic because I think on one hand, maybe especially for a typical engineer, it's like, oh, that's the kind of frou-frou part is like, a pretty building or something. But to us, it meant more than that. It meant kind of having a symbol for a community that could be proud of the power plant that they have and say,
Mm-hmm.
like, we get our power from that thing, and it's inviting. Literally, we plan to have like a lobby where people can visit and maybe have like kind of like museum exhibits or special events and stuff like that. Have it be an asset to community, but also a point of pride. Um, but also, it had to be more than just a facade, a pretty facade, right? Because for it to actually function that way, you have to have the safety in hand. You have to have um, also what we'd call security by design. So if it's safe by design, like we were just talking about, then it can also be secure by design
Mm-hmm.
because if the fuel itself protects itself from melting down and causing a radiological accident, then additionally you have less security threats that could cause a meltdown and cause an incident. So you don't need as much in the way of walls and guards and turret. Literally, like most people haven't been, but I'd encourage you to try. Odds are there's a nuclear power plant somewhere within a few hours of where you live, at least in the United States
Mm-hmm.
and certain places around the world. Like I have family in Europe and so forth, and it's the same story there. It's like take a tour if you can, because it's really a sight to see. It's an
Yeah.
immense structure. Obviously, in the most recent example in the United States, literally tens of billions of investment. They have walls. They have they literally have turrets and armed guards that walk around. It's like the most secure structure you can ever imagine. I think people kind of imagine it's like an oil refinery that you drive by and has some fences or something, but like I'm telling you, it's a fortress. And they have concrete that they have tested by flying planes into the concrete. These are immense, amazing human feats of
Mm.
engineering. Um, but what we wanted to do was reinvent that, right? Because it's so small, so safe, and so secure just by design. Like the worst case scenario, which is still not great, granted, and we protect against it, is that a bad actor can shut off power. You don't want to shut off power to a region that can be life or death, but it's not like a huge radiological incident in most of our analyses. So you analyze against all these different security scenarios. Anyway, I say all that to say that is the the meat behind why we can put a pretty picture out there. It's not because we just thought it was a pretty picture and we don't intend to
Mm.
really build it that way or we can't. We've worked with regulators to try to assess what we can do differently because it's so different from the ground up. And
Yeah.
so we designed a structure that we've always liked with this kind of A-frame aesthetic. We don't also have to do that, but it's kind of like our concept car. It's like, look, this is what it can look like. And it doesn't involve a lot of walls and turrets and guns and stuff because of the nature of the safety and the security, and because of the small size. And it doesn't take up a huge footprint. And so it can leave more land for other things. And be kind of a bit of a preserve. A lot of nuclear plants are almost like nature preserves already because they have to have so much land around them reserved to have usually kind of water resources or other land kind of standoffs from a community. But so that's cool. That's another cool feature of visiting any nuclear power plant. But I think ours specifically, we try to require the least amount of land footprint as possible and have the most appealing structure to be a point of pride for a community and basically kind of show with the eye what you can feel and feel kind of innately when you see it, like, okay, this is not threatening and it actually is that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And when it comes to these this idea of regulation around this. It's a big part of your world in biotech. It's a big part of ours because obviously to get something approved, you have to prove, beyond reasonable doubt that it's a safe, useful application of whatever the new technology is. And
Hmm.
my philosophy of regulation is um, become partners with the regulator. Don't ever think, I think it's a mistake generally to approach a
Yeah.
regulator with we need to do the minimum of anything to get the outcome that we're looking for, particularly when there is the type of people that are attracted to regulators often are those people that feel a very strong um, sense of public safety. And that is very difficult to overcome if you're not going to try and meet them where they are. And so, from my point of view, I think it's a very important it's very important for leaders to think carefully about how they engage with regulators and not consider them an adversary in the first instance. Because in my experience, walking into the regulators in Australia in a number of different contexts, they're just curious. And it's actually a point of competitive advantage when you offer to engage
Mm.
with them. In the first couple of times we did this in biotech, there was a surprise. And we thought we were going to go to our nation's capital. We were going to meet with a regulator. We walked into a room thinking there'd be two or three people that would be, the normal liaisons that you would have the conversation with. And we walked in to a room full of people on their side, and we were thoroughly underprepared for that. And it was because this never happens to them.
Hmm.
And so I guess I'd love to unpack on the Oklo side. You've been doing
Yeah.
this for some time. I'm sure you've built relationships with a number of the people at different levels of the organizations in the nuclear authority. And I would imagine, given the relationship, they actually welcome a conversation. They're not going to stop doing their job, but they're going to be more
Yes.
open and more receptive to a discussion around what if we could do this. I get it'll take a decade or more, but we'll set ourselves up for that kind of situation, if you will. What's been your
Hmm.
experience? Because I think this is one of the truest, most powerful, most competitive partnership situations that people don't ever give credit to.
I wholeheartedly agree. So, I mean, for people listening to the audio, I was smiling quite a bit during that, which is probably not a typical area for a lot of people to smile, is about working with a regulator in any industry. But exactly what you're saying is basically exactly how we approached it and felt about it. And um, it I think sitting I said this earlier in our discussion. I think sitting around and kind of blaming the regulators is a path doomed to fail anyway. Why would you do that, especially if you actually intend to do what you say you want to do, right? Like we have to work with them, and we do believe, and I think we do believe it has to be done in a different way than it was done in the past, because if not only for the fact that we're working with a different technology than they've licensed in the past. And I think that gave us, as well as the people in the regulatory agency, a bit of a clean slate. Now it's definitely a challenge, because, you know, regulatory agencies are generally set up to do checklists. Check you do this, check
Mhm.
that, and they're used to that checklist that they had for large light water reactors and water cooled reactors. And so for these small fast reactors, it's like, well, what is our checklist even? And so we had to work with them on that. Now, I think everyone would hesitate to use the word collaborate because you're not collaborating with the regulator. They still have, like you said, their
Mhm.
job to do, and we have ours. But we all had to together think of a new way to meet the exact same checklist that they already have. So we met the regulations that already exist. And the good news is the regulations themselves are pretty amenable with only a few kind of different points or exemptions, but mostly almost all can be applied directly to us, almost, I wouldn't say in the same way, but directly applied to us, even as they're directly applied to these plants that are used to
Mm.
doing for the last 50 years, 50 plus years. And so it was an interesting problem, and I think actually kind of fun for both sides in a way, because hey, together we're figuring out what the future looks like while meeting all the regulations that we know we have to meet. And they have to assure it, and we have to meet them. And so, for example, it's the types of regulations they're usually on either environmental or safety, and it's the same, like you're talking about biotech, it's the same in automotive and stuff like that. Is, you know, how are you ensuring, what are your seatbelts, what are your emissions and stuff like that. And for nuclear, it's, what kind of accidents could you possibly have in all these scenarios?
Mm.
And what does your plant look like? And then if it has a release to the public, that's what the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is our regulator, has to guard against, right? They have to protect the health and safety of the public. And so we, and they have to ensure that we've really looked at all the range of scenarios. And in fact, and you said this kind of at the beginning of this kind of question or discussion point, which was, why not show that you can do it even better? And that's what we've been working towards too, right? Because we're working with a technology that in fact can meet a higher bar than the past. And yet you don't want to unnecessarily ratchet up expectations when it's already been the safest industry, arguably safest energy and among the safest industries, period. Like the injury record for nuclear power plants is on the order of like what the number of injuries that like banks have and stuff like that. It's very
Really?
safety conscious. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So you can
Yeah.
look up like OSHA, I think in the United States keeps these statistics, and there's like ratios per a man hour, I think is how they measure it. It's been a while since I looked at it, but yeah, it's like, wow, that's like a bank. So, it's like paper cuts and stuff like that. Right. But, I'm kind of making a silly example, but you can look up the statistics and see that not only is it one of the safest energy types, it's one of the safest industries, and we can make it even safer. That's not really our goal per se because it's already so safe. But showing that to the regulator is our job, and we wanted to come up with unique ways to do it. So I could probably talk your ear off about this topic, but I love how you phrased it, and I think that was one of our initial challenges, but also kind of fun things that we set out to do. And we work with them to create a whole different application structure, which again, probably most people is like, okay, so you made a new structure of an application, but that's that checklist, right? That we have to meet, and
That's
we had to
right.
make a new one with them. And we, submitted it, and it was accepted for review. And we plotted out with them a whole new way to do kind of in-person audits instead of kind of basically a lot of paper back and forth. You can answer a lot of questions in person in a few hours that maybe if they mail us questions, we mail answers back. It's not always literally mailing, but often it is. And we saw really good benefits to that. The sad thing was we submitted our application in March of 2020, literally the week before the day that the World Health Organization declared COVID a
Yeah.
global pandemic. So the in-person audit thing didn't really work out. And so we were all scrambling to do something new, and it was always going to be hard. So it certainly has been hard, but I think there are some nuggets of excitement that we can point to, and we're still working on with them to now submit another application. And to me, that was fun.
Yeah, and there's a compounding effect that happens when you get good at doing this, right? Not only with the regulator and for other competitors who inevitably will see what you've done and go, I'm going to join the market. There is that kind of advantage you have. But then there's also the fact that if you take this offshore into other countries, they're going to look at the amount of time spent with what is probably the principal nuclear regulator in the world and just go, well, if they say it's okay, then there's a reasonably good chance we're also going to say it's okay. And then therefore expansion, at least on that dimension, becomes a little bit easier to manage.
Mm-hmm.
Caroline, when we sort of think about the other partnerships that your team is working on, there are a whole bunch of OEMs that I'm sure are now starting with the timing coming up to this, with this massive demand for power for things like data centers, for all of the new AI that we're about to start consuming at nauseum. Like there is a demand profile, which is, I don't think people fully understand yet on the power side. Beyond, say, Switch, that I know that your team have done deals with previously, I understand Siemens is also one of those partners that is coming or understanding they want to be more part of your business. How do you and the team
Yeah.
think about, given the stage you're at right now, the way to approach those partners? Because obviously they will need to bring something to the table. You obviously have a range of things that you would like to leverage from a partnership. What's the mental model that you and the team sort of go through to work out how not to burn a whole bunch of time on a whole bunch of big
Yeah.
brands that might look good on face value but might not actually deliver the real value that the company needs?
Yeah. I'll try to answer that question in two parts, but it's still more art than science, I think, because really you're kind of brought up at least two different kinds of partnerships. One is a supplier relationship with Siemens, which we're really excited about. Um, and again, I'll harken to the large power plants that are kind of typical in the United States and often around the world. Is, you know, there's the reactor produces heat, and that heat is turned into electricity, if you're going to simplify it, right? And that really is what's happening, right? It makes heat, makes steam, and then makes electricity out of the steam. And so I think the biggest, the thing, well, there's basically two parts. In the nuclear industry, we call it the primary side and the secondary side. And the secondary side is the side that takes all that heat and turns it into electricity. And that can be a really big part of the plant. And still in many nuclear plants, not like ours, but the bigger, water cooled plants, that secondary side still has to meet what's called nuclear grade quality assurance, because if it goes out, it can cause risks that could cause the reactor to melt down or have radiological accident. And so that's a huge part of the plant that's very expensive, because you have to get very particular kinds of turbines and valves and, all the things. For us, that doesn't pose a risk to the fuel staying intact. So one of the neat things is for us, we can actually work with conventional global suppliers of these things that take steam and turn it into electricity. This is done all the time on the oil and gas side, and other kinds of plants produce heat and they turn into electricity. And so we can work with Siemens, who makes these things basically more or less off the shelf. I'm putting that in air quotes, but it's something that they mass produce and can produce relatively quickly. I'd say like 18 months or so is something like what they look at for producing those sorts of things. And so what we've always said is, if we build just one plant, we feel like that's certainly an accomplishment, but it's honestly, it would be a big disappointment to us, because we can't make the impact we want to have making just one plant. So our eye is always on, how do we mass produce these? How do we actually have an impact? And you'd have to really make a tremendous amount of electricity in a lot of these plants to make the impact that we want to have. And so how do we work with suppliers to have that kind of impact? And Siemens is one of those. They can basically make that whole secondary side for us and mass produce it. And so we're already looking towards, how can we do this as quickly and efficiently as possible? And so that's yet another one of the unique kind of outcomes of the unique characteristics that Oklo has, is that we can work with suppliers like that and do things that no one's really looked at doing, and kind of making it manufacturable. Like, people talk about like an assembly line or like a car, like a plane, but yeah, just how do we think about mass producing these and increasing, again, the quality of the outcome? When you talk about a massive one-off plant, you don't gain those efficiencies and quality assurance or cost. No. It just keeps being stick built and prone to human error, frankly. So that's one type of partnership we're really excited about. Siemens, I would say, is one really key one, because that's basically our whole secondary side, like I said. But there's a number of them that are exciting that you can think about looking forward. But that's probably one of the biggest, and one that we announced relatively quickly in terms of like where we are in the life cycle, because it's such a big part of our plant. And then you talked about kind of customer side partnerships too, which data centers have become such a large potential part of our customership. But you look at global energy demand and projected increases in global energy demand, data centers are just front and center there. And you can find numbers that say almost everything you can imagine, but I've seen numbers that look like tripling energy energy consumption by 2030, which is looking less and less far away. But that was just last year that I saw that number being put out by a leading consulting firm. And so it's almost like the sky's the limit. If you produce power, people are going to need it. And so how do we get there as fast as possible? So partnering with customers that know the energy demand or have the energy demand themselves is pretty important. Your question was about, how do we prioritize? And that's, kind of a key day-to-day question for us, because there's so much demand, and how do we prioritize? But I think you use different metrics on who is most serious. And a lot of times that involves who's ready to start putting money where their mouth is in terms of
Hmm.
investing in energy.
Yeah.
So we've seen that from certain customers they all have the need and they all want to talk, but who's ready to kind of put their money where their mouth is. And we've seen some customers literally kind of give up from payments and be willing to engage with us in the regulatory process that they know is going to be next. And so
Yeah.
if they're ready to sign agreements, put money where their mouth is, and or some combination of those, as well as engaging with the regulator with us, that's kind of how we see seriousness and kind of prioritize different customer partnerships.
Yeah, it makes sense. When I'm coaching organizations around partnerships, that the biggest thing is
Mm,
around readiness. Sadly,
mm,
there is a number of things that we don't want to miss in the lead up to that as well. And one of those is, how do we get super clear on intent? Because when we're thinking about
mm-hmm.
a program like what you're talking about here, this is a multi-decade process. And for the most part, people's capacity to understand how intent changes over time is very difficult to do. So we spend a lot of time, which actually ends up being a very, very well time spent between the two parties when they sort of work out, actually, no, we share the same language now. We understand what this looks like, and we haven't assumed that when somebody says regulator, that they go, oh yeah, that'll be fine. When you actually go, no, this will take us a decade. So if you're good for that, and we don't know how it's going to play out, but we're good to be shoulder to shoulder through that process, then that's a very, very positive sign, because there's nothing worse than investing so much time and it becomes a flash in the pan, right? It's sort of, press release goes out, everyone's feeling great, and 6 months in, it's sort of dead on arrival. They're the
Yeah.
things you want to try and avoid at all costs.
And to be really clear, like, we've taken a decade to get to this place, and, we went public last year and we're able to, raise a lot of funds that way. But now we're in this place where the regulatory path is not so long.
Right.
Actually, Congress has limited, and it's almost paradoxical, right? Or I don't know. It's like in biotech, they're very used to, decade-long time scales,
Mm.
especially from identification of a compound to trials to all these things. In nuclear, it's actually relatively fast. And what I mean by that is, once you get through pre-application, which is really the time you spend familiarizing the regulator. So we did so much of that. We have a new technology, new size range, new fuel type, and I say new, again, it's been proven, it's been around for decades, and we have this data, especially in the United States, of how it will behave, but new to them in the commercial sense. And
Of
so
course. Yeah.
getting familiar with that, getting the application structure ironed out, and working with the team to educate them on what accident scenarios look like and all those things. So we've done all that back work, but the neat thing is the application itself. Congress has directed the regulator to issue timelines for review, and the
Hmm.
timeline that they issued for this application type is 3 years. And that
Right.
includes both construction and operations. So at the end of 3 years, you should be able to
Oh,
both
that's good.
construct and operate.
Right.
You can divvy it up where you can do early construction. It's called construction work in progress, and different kinds of limited work authorizations to start actually construction even before that point. For us, with a small plant and relatively small footprint, like I said, outsourcing the secondary side, the actual construction is supposed to be, pretty quick. So that's not our biggest concern, is starting construction before the granting of the operations license. But it is, I think, in most regulatory worlds, 3 years is lightning fast. But what's even
Hmm.
more exciting is now the NRC actually just issued a paper, and Congress has also kind of been directing them to be thinking about this, is how can they license these small plants, often called microreactors, on the order of 6 months. And so that's the real
Wow.
exciting piece that could be
Yeah.
coming to bear. And it's funny because I feel like historically we've been kind of hinting at or thinking ourselves, based on our knowledge of the regulations and stuff, it could be as quick as 6 months. I hesitated to ever say that because it's
Mm.
so aggressive. And it's like, it could be, as short as a year or 6 months and stuff like that. But now we can actually kind of say that out loud because there's literally these efforts working towards 6 months. In licensing. So it could be lightning fast, but the thing that's really interesting is once you've done it once, you can use that same application for that same design again and again and again, and they don't have to re-review the things they already reviewed. They'd only review the things that are site specific for each new plant.
Right.
So like, let's say, this plant's in this state next to this kind of facility, and this plant's in another state, maybe has different, honestly, volcanic even, we analyzed to like the most extreme events and sometimes most infrequent events. So even things like volcanoes and earthquakes might be different site to site, probably obviously. And so you'd have to review those kinds of new aspects for each site, but the design part and all the things that aren't changing from site to site, they don't have to re-review. So that's where, you can actually have many applications under review at the same time. And that's where we see we have a pathway, at least in the United States, for scale. Different
Mm.
countries have different rules and different ways of doing the application process. So I would say, in certain countries, we are looking at something like a decade or even 15 years. Uh, the way for instance, the Canadian process is set up right now is roughly like that. But I know they're working with the United States to learn and change. And it might be a situation where, and sorry, I'm talking your ear off, but, I think, we've seen sometimes developing countries leapfrog developed countries in certain
Correct.
regulated areas.
Yeah.
And for example, the story I heard is in certain countries, developing countries, they got mobile banking before they even had brick and mortar banking because that's the nature of the development is they kind of
Hmm.
skipped that whole history that we had in some of the more developed countries. And I think that could be the case for nuclear as well, where they're still overseen by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. They're still probably working with the United States. There's a lot of rules around nuclear technology, even globally. So it's not like, I don't know, some rogue nation's going to do something too crazy, I don't believe, but they're able to, like I've been hearing stories about El Salvador trying to stand up a new regulatory process. They can take our lessons learned
Hmm.
and probably
Absolutely.
leapfrog in some ways and be more efficient right off the bat than maybe we are with 50 years of legacy history and legal precedent and so forth. So it's interesting to think about what's possible now in terms of regulatory timelines.
Yeah, but I mean, you and the team have done the work, right? This is the thing that I think a lot of people forget. You see a company list, and it's going from strength to strength. There's a lot of um, things you've got to report and comment on and share to market. But what often people
Yeah.
don't see is the really tough work that went on for a really long time and a huge
Yeah.
amount of uncertainty
Yeah.
to try and make all of that come
Yeah.
to life, right? So I think
Yeah.
huge kudos to you and the team.
Thank
Um,
you.
I am mindful of the time we have, and I am going to talk. Our teams will talk to try and find more time to talk because I think there's plenty more for us to cover. Um, where can people find more out about Oklo, and for them to go on I guess, a nuclear understanding journey?
Mm,
How would you suggest for people who have, particularly in Australia,
yeah.
there is a lot of talk about nuclear at the moment, and there is a lot of cost
Hmm.
prohibitive discussion around that right now. Um, and when I've shared this with colleagues who are knowledgeable in the space, particularly in levels of government, they've said, as soon as this becomes a commercial prototype, it will spread like wildfire because of the demand profile and the options that really we don't have anymore for more gas, more coal, more. So I'm just curious, where can people go? Where can we direct them to? And if you were to say to somebody,
Yeah.
here's how you go and learn about the journey of nuclear and what Oklo can offer, where would you send them?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question I get all the time, and I don't always have the best resource. I don't feel like I have one single amazing resource, but I have a couple recommendations I might make. One I'll say we give to all our employees that come on, specific to fast reactors and the promise for recycling nuclear waste, is this book called Plentiful Energy. I worry that it's not even in print, but you can get copies of it relatively easily still. And even I was able to find online a PDF copy of it. It's
Hmm.
not maybe the most fun way to read it, but it is a way. And that book just talks about the history of the fast reactor and what promise it had and why it works and how it works. It's a little wonky, but specific to that technology, it's a good read. I think it works
Okay,
for both technical and non-technical. Um,
we'll
but
link to that.
I think you have to be non-technical with a little appetite to wade through some
Sure.
technical. But yeah, we recommend it to all of our employees, technical or not. I'll say there's just a broad history of nuclear in general. I think there's some great blogs out there and people who've really invested time to document some of the historical stuff or fun
Hmm.
facts or just make it interesting. And I think what is nuclear? It's I think it's both a blog and a podcast by this guy named Nick Turan. I think that's a great resource, and he's usually spot on with his kind of research, and he spends a lot of time on it. Um, And I think it covers all sorts of nuclear topics. So there's a lot of different fascinating things surrounding the nuclear technology topic, whether it's kind of different types of new technologies, older technologies, um, random historical kind of events, and even different kind of applications. Like one of the things we're looking into with the recycling process is how to make use of different nuclear radioactive isotopes that are used
Hmm.
for medical imaging, cancer
Right.
treatment, and so forth. So there's so many different things that all kind of tie in, are interesting to learn about. And I think that's maybe another good resource. I think the U.S. Department of Energy has some good resources as well, just for like kind of primers. And I believe they even helped fund like a children's book and things like that. But I might direct people there. Of course, I would trust the information that they put out on average. And yeah, maybe those are a couple of good resources.
Nice. We'll also link to the website so people can have a look at the Aurora project and the other great things
Yeah,
you've got on the website.
that'd be wonderful. Mm-hmm.
Carolyn, I've just thoroughly loved this conversation and I'm looking forward to the next one. Before I let you go, though, I'd love
Thanks.
to run through our rapid fire, which we have at the end of
Okay.
every episode. Are you good for that?
Yes.
All right. So, 5 questions. Um, let me give you the first one. Complete this sentence. Partnership is.
Constructive.
What content are you loving at the moment? And it can be anything, by the way.
Yeah, I've been enjoying a couple different things. One is a, a, a podcast on history. So I've been enjoying that. There's another podcast called Business Wars, and I've always enjoyed that because they kind of reenact certain historical kind of classic business rivalries, like Levi's jeans and Lee's jeans, or
Hmm.
Coke versus Pepsi, that kind of thing, Apple versus Microsoft. So it's just interesting to hear it, and they make it engaging. So I've been enjoying that kind of content. There's one other kind of subject area that I found interesting, which is kind of the study of resources across the world as well as populations across the world, and kind of what implications population dynamics are having in kind of global geopolitics. I think that's pretty
Hmm.
fascinating, and has been interesting to watch how people having or not having kids has kind of shaped trajectories of nations, frankly, and so and what could happen there in the future. So I've been finding that kind of content interesting as well.
Yeah, it's super interesting. On the history side, the Rest is History podcast is one that my wife and
Hmm.
I absolutely love. It's the humor
Thank
inside
you.
that and the things, the parts of history that you just don't know happened. It's like,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense now. Yeah, this part of the world now makes a lot of
Cool.
sense
Okay,
because
I'll
of
check
that.
that out.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
It's good. All right. What's the worst piece of advice you received and why?
I saw this question and I didn't have a ton of time to think about it, but the first thing that popped in my mind was if you want something done right, do it yourself. And I say that kind of, I think there's two sides to that coin. I think that kind of mentality has been maybe ingrained in me, maybe something that I would take pride in the sense of like, a lot of the things we described are things that we just believe were possible and took it on to do, right? And so
Mm,
I'm proud of that. But at the same time, I think it can be a dangerous piece of advice in the sense of like, that doesn't scale. Doing things
no,
just yourself doesn't scale.
it does not.
And so I think, as we've grown the company, realizing how to scale out of the different things that I thought I was good at personally
Mhm.
has been a growing experience for me. And especially kind of this trajectory from being a public company and continuing to scale. We've roughly doubled in size ish the last several years. And so we
Mhm.
went from a 20-person company to, 40-ish person company to like an 80-person company, and now 100 and some odd, and growing all the time. And so, how do you think about how to scale? So one, that doesn't scale. Two, it doesn't really value the need for your first question, which is like partnerships.
Yeah.
And the 1+1=3 kind of, that sounds like business speak or something, but like, you can actually get even more than just the sum of the parts
Yeah.
out when you work with people in different ways. And so I think the mentality of like, you want something done right, do it yourself, is kind of limiting in the sense of like, what if you find someone who's really good at something, and how do you unleash that capability that they have?
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the most fun jobs we have building a company, is finding these people who are just awesome at what they do
Yeah.
and bringing them in and like setting them loose and creating an environment that is like a vivarium for them to do what they love to do and what they're good at. And so it's just
Mhm.
fun to kind of create that. And and have that flourish over a lot of years. I think we've always enjoyed kind of finding those people and setting them loose. And right now, and I hope for a long time to come, the culture at Oklo is something I'm really proud of. And the people of Oklo are something I'm really proud of. And I think that's a secret to our success. So that was the first thing that popped in my mind.
So just so you know, in the prep that our teams did together, I jumped in on a few of the conversations. I can tell that's true. It's pretty awesome. Really good. All right. Question number 4. When you see potential for a new partnership, what's the first thing you do to turn that potential into action?
Potential for new pressure turn into action. Yeah, I think, well, we talked about some of that a little bit. I think like the first thing that I would do is have a conversation about, kind of where they're at. And I think there's, not always is that in person, but I think often it's beneficial to just sit down next to a person. It's very old school, but I think there's something about, there are decision makers within an entity and people who they either are excited about a partnership and have ideas and that is an idea that's allowed to flourish within that entity or it's not. Mm-hmm. And so getting to know the people within that entity that we're trying to have a partnership with and get inside their head about what they see as the future would be kind of, my first step. So kind of a meeting of the minds, I guess.
Yeah, I love that. That's really good. All right, final question. What is one thing you're deeply grateful for right now?
Oh, gosh. Family. Yeah, it's probably a cliche answer, but we had our first child also last year. So we took our company public and then we had our first child and it's
not doing
also
anything
gone
in
through
halves.
some kind of, what?
Not doing anything in halves.
No, I like that phrase. Yeah. So it wasn't anticipated to take quite that long for the whole go public process, but what was going to be fall of 23 became summer of 24. And so and Jake and I, co-founders, but we're also married. We were married since before the company ever started. And anyway, so for both of us as kind of CEO and COO to also be having our first child and newly have a public company and all those things, we needed a good amount of support from family and we're creating our own family. So I'm grateful for, you kind of see in a new way what your parents did for you when you were a kid and even in new ways, I'm grateful for them because they're helping us out now. So anyway, that's probably a thing I'm deeply grateful for right now.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, look, we've got 2 little girls and it gives a very different lens on life. And the mission you're on is going to benefit them incredibly. So super cool.
Yeah, even more motivating.
Yeah. Carolyn Cochran, thank you so much for the time today. We'll be talking soon, no doubt, but for everybody who wants to learn more about Oklo, all the details are in the show notes and we will link to the books we've talked about and also the other resources too. Thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you again, Phil. Yes, likewise.
Before you go, I have a quick question for you. Do you worry that you're wasting time, money, and credibility with the wrong partnerships? It's exhausting to pretend everything's fine while secretly worrying that you've made the wrong call. You see others thriving with the right connections, and you're stuck wondering if you're missing out on opportunities that could really elevate your business. Well, the good news is that ends today because you can download my free partner calculator that instantly assesses if a partner is an ideal fit for your business. It'll give you the clarity and the confidence and the edge you've been looking for to secure high-value partnerships that not only finally unlock business growth, but also help you reclaim your time. The link is in the show notes. And I'm really glad you're here. I'm Coach Phil Hay Sinclair. I'll see you in the next episode.